Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. And for once, I can do it in the morning hours because I am only one time zone removed from my guest today, which is a nice change of pace. And my guest today comes from the Emerald Isle of all things, working at Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. Some Americans might think more of Shannon as the airport they fly into when they go to Limerick. But I'm joined today by Anne-Marie Brosnan. She is a lecturer of history education and has also a PhD in um, education. But we're going to talk today about a new book that she brought out with Fordham University Press, which is A Contested Terrain: Freed People's Education in North Carolina During the Civil War and Reconstruction. So first of all, thank you so much for joining me this morning and taking a little time off for this. So we chatted a little before. You did a elementary school education before you became a university lecturer, and you wrote a book about a U.S. state, even though you are in Ireland. And yeah, how does this all come to happen?
Mhm. Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Niels, for inviting me onto your podcast. This is a great opportunity, and I feel very privileged to be able to talk to you and your listeners about my book. So, thank you for the invitation. So yeah, exactly. As you said, I did my undergraduate degree in education, and I trained as an elementary school teacher, and I began working as an elementary school teacher. And when I graduated, it was smack bang in the middle of a big economic recession. And because the teachers and the education system in Ireland is state funded, there were very few jobs available. So it was a difficult time to be a teacher, and you were moving from school to school in temporary positions. And I was fortunate enough at the time to study history to degree level in addition to my education degree. And now that element of the program has been removed from the education program, but I was lucky enough to be able to avail of it at the time. And so I decided, due to the issues that a lot of my cohort had in getting permanent teaching positions, to go back and do a master's in history. I felt I just didn't have the experience in education to do a master's in education. So I went back to do a master's in history, and I thought, since I have a degree in education and a degree in history, it might be nice to merge the two. Now, interestingly, as an undergraduate student, I did not like learning about the history of education. I found it very boring. And that's something that my students kind of find amusing when I tell them that. So I kind of started to dig deep into history of education topics that I might be interested in, and I was always interested in American history. My dad actually was born in San Francisco. My grandparents, excuse me. My grandparents immigrated there in around the 1940s, so he was born there. But I don't necessarily have any connection. I actually don't have any connection at all to North Carolina or to the South, really. Um, but I was very interested in American history. I was very interested in the history of race relations in the United States. I was very interested in Southern history. And when I was researching topics, the voices of formerly enslaved people were beginning to be foregrounded by a new generation of historians. So a lot of work was beginning to be published that looked at well-told histories from an African American perspective. And this was something that really, really intrigued me. So I decided to start focusing on the educational experiences of enslaved people in North Carolina. And that began that long journey of looking at this particular topic.
Wow, so I mean, it's quite something to think of, like you're in Ireland and you're working on like North Carolina as a topic area. So, like, did you do a lot of research trips, or were you lucky that some of this material was online? And
Yeah, so um when I first began looking at this topic, there wasn't a whole pile of
mm,
material that was digitized. Now, that has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. There were some things that had been digitized, but not a lot. The digitization process had definitely begun, but we weren't anywhere near where we are now. That being said, a lot of archivists in certain archives or libraries are very willing to
mm,
support people who are studying abroad and scan
hmm
documents and email them. And
yeah.
some places charge minimal fees, some places don't charge anything at all.
Mm,
I was able to get a lot of microfilm sent over from libraries
mm,
to my institution in Ireland, which was brilliant as well. And then, of course, I studied in the United States. So I was very lucky to be the recipient of a Fulbright scholarship,
mhm,
which allowed me to study at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I got a couple of other fellowships, one of which was from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in New
mhm,
York, which allowed me to conduct archival research at the New York Public Library. So there definitely was a bit of both. Now, I actually haven't been to the United States since 2019, but because the digitization of resources is so well developed now, I have been able to access, amazing resources that I actually wasn't even able to access in North Carolina because they might have been up in the New England area or something like that. So, that's not to say I won't go over again, and that's not
mm,
to say that a lot of the smaller archives, still need to be accessible in person.
mm.
Yeah, that's how I approached it.
No, yeah, I mean that's for especially us overseas. It's a great achievement now that we can still do our work from
Mhm,
Europe, even though we're not, or we can't like financially want to afford the long research trip. It's
mhm,
quite expensive after all.
absolutely.
Um, so I want to stick with sources a little bit because obviously you're looking at education, and part of that is you're looking at white teachers that are going south, but you're also looking at free black people that move in south,
Mhm,
individuals in the south that are becoming teachers, and of course the free communities that are the beneficiaries of all of that.
mhm,
So in all of that, we're looking at, or you're looking really at groups that are just starting to learn to read and write. So what was sort of the challenge in sort of giving voices to people that are oftentimes in the archives the voiceless?
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key sources that I used was a database created by Ronald E. Butchert and his colleagues at UGA. And it was a database of over 12,000 men and women from a variety of different regional and ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds who taught former slaves throughout the American South. And so I got access to the North Carolina section of that database very early on before it was published and made available to the public. And that database contained about 1,400 men and women who taught in North Carolina between 1862 and 1875. And the reason why that database was so instrumental and continues to be so instrumental to me now as I progress with this research and look at different elements of it is because when a name is mentioned in passing in the archives, whether that's the Freedmen's Bureau records or maybe it's in a diary or a letter, you can cross-reference that name with the database and immediately get access to their race, their birth year, whether they served in the military, where they taught, how long they taught for, under what missionary association, if any, were they sponsored, where their home was, and so forth. So that proved to be really, really instrumental because if you are looking at the archives without access to that database, you will see names and you won't know anything about those people. Um, And there could be a very rich
mm,
history and a very rich story behind those individual names. And now sometimes, unfortunately, the database doesn't give full information for every teacher, but a lot of work went into kind of giving the
mm,
most robust information that it possibly could. Sometimes then as well, of course, you might get a name, you might get information like their biographical data from the database, but you can't get anything else. And that's a struggle that historians face, unfortunately. But again, over time, as new sources come to light, or as families began
mm,
exploring more about their family histories,
mm,
more and more information can be published.
mm,
So very recently, I was looking at a woman from North Carolina, a white woman from North Carolina who taught former slaves. Her husband was an ex-Confederate grocer. He was quite poor, and it's likely that she began teaching to support herself and her two young children. Um, and I kind of got that information from the Freedmen's Bureau
mm,
records and from the Freedmen's Teacher Project. And then when I looked her up on Ancestry.com, I was able to access photos and lots of other documents that her family had
mm,
begun to create and put together as a family tree. I don't think that was there when I first did this research all those years ago. So, things are constantly evolving and developing, and
mm,
like I said earlier, having access to databases like Ancestry.com and things like that enables us to tell the picture by piecing
mm.
together all these little snapshots from a variety of different sources.
Yeah, but it's also sort of a crowdsourcing because, like you said, like you have the family that is working on that family tree, and you
Mhm.
can be like going in there and be like, oh,
Yeah,
that's the person I'm interested in. Let me see what they
yeah,
found.
yeah, yeah.
Um, that is impressive. Like I mean,
Hmm.
the just thinking 15 years ago or 10 years ago, that would have been extremely difficult to do, and you would
Yeah,
have had to do all that footwork.
exactly. Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah. Um, so, um, mhm. Yeah, I'm kind of trying to think like you bring that database in here already as a conversation, or that Freedom Teachers project in already as a point because I wanted to talk about that later, but we may as well kind of start here. What as sort of a s- teacher for teachers, how do you see that? How could this be beneficial for teachers as they kind of think about learning about the past or for their students as projects?
So are you referring to my student teachers that I teach or
In
someone else?
general, like what do you think would be the best, would be a great way to use that for teacher education or for teaching?
Okay. I think the database is a really useful tool for researchers and for students because it allows us to apply a quantitative element
Mm,
to the stories that we're telling. So a lot of the work that we do as historians is qualitative, and it's based on the words or the letters of people.
mhm,
And that's really important. But there are also limitations to that. Who wrote? When did they write? Why did they write? Who were they writing to? What did they write for? As historians, we need to take all of those things into consideration, which is fine, and we do that. And I think, we do that quite well. But the database then allows you to quantify who thought, where they thought, when they thought,
mhm,
and it can be used as a really useful source
mhm,
in addition to the qualitative
mhm,
sources, the archives, the letters, the
mhm,
newspapers, the diaries. So, for example, I have come across teachers from the North in particular, so Northern white women in particular, who would have wrote letters for their sponsoring
mhm,
organization, like the American Missionary Association. And the purpose of these letters was to publish them in the society's monthly organs. And then they would have used these letters to spread word in the north about what was happening in the south and to solicit aid and donations and things like that. So there was a very clear intent to the publication of these letters. The teachers knew this, the people in charge knew this. And so the teachers would often sort of like embellish, they might embellish certain elements, they might embellish, the conditions, they might embellish their motivations in
Hmm.
particular, and they would say that they love this work and they're thrilled with what's
Hmm.
happening and all the rest of it. But then when you look at the database, they only taught for 1 year. They came down, they left again. They clearly weren't as committed as they said they were. Um, so I think using the database alongside archival sources like that is really, really crucial. Another reason why it was very good for me to use and very good for future historians to use and students to use is because, like I said earlier, it gave concrete evidence of who thought, when they thought, and for how long they thought. So when you look at North Carolina, for example, um, we can see without a shadow of a doubt that the vast majority of men and women who thought former slaves were Southern black men and women. So, previous histories, long before this have suggested that, and the archives suggested that they played a very strong role in, the growth and development of Southern Black schooling. But this database can prove that, and it can
Hmm.
literally give the numbers. So out of 1,419 teachers exactly who taught in North Carolina, 705 of them were black. And then there's about 143 which were Southern
Hmm.
white, and some less than 300 that were Northern white. So it gives really, really concrete evidence, and it really
Hmm.
puts that quantitative element to your work, which is it's more difficult to deny.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's exactly sort of where I was hoping this would go, because in many ways that it gives you sort of it gives you a raw materials that you can kind of then fill in holes, but it's sort of like, if I know that on average, and you calculated that really interestingly in your book in a few places, of like, so the average white northern woman coming down stays 2.5 years, or the average southern teacher is in the pro in there for 3 years.
Mhm.
And it it gives you a sense, but it also is, it's averages, right? That
Mhm. Mhm.
it's like you have maybe one person that stays for a year, and then you have a person that stays for 6 years.
Mhm.
It doesn't tell you like, oh, this person was in a very clan heavy district versus
Yeah.
this one in a very peaceful area. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of nuances that you still have to fill in.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And I did come across that, that point that you raised is very important because um North Carolina and the South in general was just so diverse for Black and white people, particularly during military Reconstruction. And particularly while, Union forces were stationed in the state.
mm,
So um, it's really important to kind of look at those nuances and, in particular, look at how the development of education may have played out in specific
mm,
areas. So in Raleigh, for example, a lot of the teachers, whether they were white or black, northern or southern, had a pretty peaceful time in comparison to their contemporaries in other areas of the
mm,
state. And the main reason was because of the presence of the military who were there who were able to protect them. So there was a really interesting book that came out recently about the life of a northern white teacher named Harriet M. Buss. And her letters were published in an edited collection.
mm,
And unlike a lot of other Northern white teachers who experienced like social ostracism and,
mm,
white Southerners refusing to engage with them, to board them, to sell to them,
mm,
Harriet M. Bus reported that in Raleigh, everything went well. You know, she was
Yeah.
treated with courtesy, people were
Mhm.
pleasant, the storekeepers were kind to her. And when you look at it within the broader context, well, one of the main reasons for that was
Mhm.
because of the strong military presence. But in
Mhm.
areas where there was less of a military presence, the experience could be vastly different.
Yeah, and this, again, a great segue because in part you're looking at a very a set of very diverse regions because North Carolina going from like the coast all the way to the mountains. The kind of urban cores there was Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, Charlotte eventually. Uh, so you have this, and like the coastal plains obviously was heavy plantation, then the tobacco belt, the mountains that just nothing, and in that regard. And you're also looking at because, and this is something maybe we can start with chronologically because you're starting in the Civil War because the occupation starts on the coast, and that's where the first freedmen are searching for new opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first school was established for former slaves in 1862 on Roanoke Island, where a freedmen's colony was established. And Patricia Click does really, really great work on that colony in particular. She's published really great work on that colony, and she's got a lovely website as well with lots of sources available. Um, and actually, interestingly, the first person to establish that school was a formerly enslaved woman
Hmm.
named Martha Cullen, which is interesting. So even though, like you correctly said, a lot of enslaved people did not have access to education prior to the Reconstruction period. Um, Very often, well, an estimated 5 to 10% of enslaved people could read by the beginning of the Civil War. But even if you had even if you were semi-literate, even if you had the very basics, enslaved people would literally teach what they could, yeah, when they could. And people were very, very graciously accepted that. So that began in 1862. And then in response to the free people's demand for education, in those like Union camp areas along the east, Northern Aid and Missionary Societies began sending teachers to the state. And again, like you said, a lot of these were in the eastern region around New Bern and Beaufort and places like that, which were under military occupation. And then gradually, as the civil, as when the Civil War ended and the Reconstruction period began, Northern Aid and Missionary Societies began increasing their efforts. But you also had a lot of Southern Black people in particular establish schools that were self-supporting. And these were schools that did not have the support or the financial support of a Northern Aid and Missionary Society. And they typically generated an income by raising tuition fees from the children, which could average around 50 cents, I think was it per week or per month. Now, often these children couldn't afford to pay those fees, so the children or their parents might make a payment in kind, maybe eggs or chicken or fuel or something along those lines. So we did have a lot of self-supporting schools, and these are the schools that were in the more rural parts of the state. So they lacked the support from the aid and missionary societies partly because the Aid and Missionary Societies didn't have the funding to finance a large number of schools, but also because the Aid and Missionary Societies definitely preferred employing white teachers over black teachers. And there was that sort of like reform agenda associated with a lot of the missionary societies. They wanted to um, utilize, northern white female teachers in particular to inculcate the former slaves with particular values and things like that. So they were less likely to support black teachers, particularly southern black teachers, but northern black teachers also found it difficult to secure employment, excuse me, with the Northern Native Missionary Societies. So a lot of those schools in the interior, in the rural parts of the state, were self-supporting schools established by black individuals or black communities. They would have gotten together to get the land, to build the schoolhouse, to raise the necessary funds, to find a teacher. They did a lot of work to really kind of get these schools going. And some of them were able to apply to the Freedmen's Bureau for aid. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau also operated on a limited mandate, so they couldn't necessarily pay for teachers, but they could pay for the rent of a school building, which was normally between $8 and $10 per month, and that would have been used to supplement the teachers' wages. But again, then in the western regions of the state, which were more mountainous, as you said, and they were also difficult, areas were difficult to access. You might have no school at all. You might have lots of children, lots of people willing and able and wanting a school, but no school at all. Or you might have people who are just unable to access these areas either
Right.
via rail or stagecoach. They were just literally inaccessible. So we see that when the public school system was established in 1869, James Walker Hood, he
Mm.
was the a black assistant superintendent, and he sort of he administered the black public schools. He said, areas beyond the Blue Ridge Mountain, I literally cannot get to. I just can't get to those areas.
Yeah, it's things still a little bit of a difficulty sometimes, and there's
Hmm.
still stereotypes attached, unfortunately, to the Appalachian region, unfortunately, of course,
Hmm.
there. But I just think it's what I really enjoy was a lot of the new studies on slavery and Reconstruction coming out is sort of the complicating of previously held beliefs about what what the enslaved experience was, and um, especially in your case, right, that you have formerly enslaved people who barely themselves know how to read and write,
Hmm.
immediately turning around and that little bit of knowledge they finally gain trying to
Hmm.
communicate to others.
Hmm.
So what does that tell us about sort of the hopes and dreams and wishes that enslaved people are putting into this post-recon or into this Reconstruction post-emancipation world?
Hmm. I think one of the things it really shows us is like how prevalent Black agency was at this
Hmm.
time. None of this would have, well, some of it would have happened, but it definitely wouldn't have happened to the extent that it happened had it not been for Southern Black men and women, the vast majority of whom were former slaves, taking control and taking initiative and coming together as communities to create schools for themselves and their children. There were stories of individual black men and women who didn't have any children who still, financed schools, supported
Hmm.
schools, donated land, donated materials, not for their own betterment, not for the betterment
Hmm.
of their children, but for the betterment of their people. And I think that's something that was really, really striking. How determined they were to get control of education, how determined they were to take control of their own schools. And like you said, this was evident from the get-go. Like, I mean, in North Carolina, former slaves began self-emancipating at the very beginning of the war. They began, traveling hundreds of miles to Union camps in the eastern areas. And as soon as they were there, conditions were deplorable. The Union camps were unsanitary. They didn't have appropriate accommodation, medical supplies, food. But regardless, one of the first things they looked for was an education, which was just really, really striking.
Yeah, and also like this is people who are just gained their freedom, who
Mhm.
have the clothes on their backs,
Mhm.
and they're already thinking of like what little money I can find, I want
Mhm.
to devote some of that to education. That's just
Mhm.
like incredible to
Mhm.
think
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
in regard to commitment.
Absolutely. And there's so many stories, of little children traveling like really long distances to
Mm,
go to school, in very difficult conditions sometimes, particularly when the public school system was established. And more kind of like systemic racism becoming
Hmm.
entrenched within the public school system. Very often, um, schools for Black children would have been situated in more remote areas. They might have been obstructed by creeks and things like that. But the children would have made a really, really strong effort to get to those schools regardless, without shoes, without proper clothing, without food, so it's really remarkable.
Yeah, and it's also and I think I want to circle back to that eventually again a little bit too, sort of in sort of a reflection on what all the things you've written in sort of our times, but it's also shows a real pride in that we have this school and it will help our community become more educated and more prosperous.
Absolutely. And one of the things that was quite interesting, because we know that a lot of the former slaves were, illiterate or
Mm.
semi-literate at best. A minority might have had a decent enough education. The interesting thing, and I'm still kind of teasing it out, I'm in the middle of writing an article about Southern white teachers,
Mm.
white North Carolinians. And one of the interesting things was that they were Southern Black people, former enslaved people, were quite practical
Hmm.
about accepting, the support of white individuals, whether they were from the North or whether they were from the South, and gaining access to education through them.
Hmm.
But as they got access to education through the Free People schools and then later through a variety of different institutes for higher education that were established throughout the state, in particular normal schools, then they began exhibiting a strong desire to be educated by members of their own race.
Hmm.
So I think that's quite telling as well. From the beginning, even though some of the white teachers were arguably well intentioned, and those
Hmm.
motivations and their practices, require a lot of like thought, you need to kind of dig deep into figuring out what went on. But they recognized that they were better off being educated by members of their own race. And I
Hmm.
think that's something that's really interesting as well. They were happy to be taught, in most cases, by Southern and Northern white individuals during the beginning of the Civil War and Reconstruction period. But as they began to gain their skills in education, um, they desired to be educated by members of their own race.
Yeah. Ooh, you just opened like three doors that I want to go immediately through, but we can't do them simultaneously, unfortunately. So let's stick with the white Southerners that are becoming teachers, and you do. I think you said it's about 300 that are in the database, and I guess sort of the challenge there is sort of is this generally like, oh, I want to do something good. Oh, I feel guilty about slavery. Or is it, ooh, they're now free. I need to find a way to still control them.
Okay, yeah. So great question. In North Carolina, it was actually a combination of all of those things. And the reason why I would say that definitively about North Carolina is because North Carolina was home to a relatively large Quaker population.
Mm,
In that area known as the Quaker Belt. And Quakers were historically opposed to slavery, and they were known to have established schools for
mm,
enslaved people and free people of color from, the late 1700s. So they already had a history of supporting Black
mm,
people in education from the 18th century. And so when we look at the white Quaker teachers, the
mm,
white Quaker teachers in North Carolina, they were genuinely interested in providing educational opportunities to formerly enslaved people. And they had absolutely zero interest, which is important as well,
mm,
in converting them to
mm.
Quakerism. Because a lot of the
We'll get
religious
there.
societies, yeah, and a lot of the religious teachers, there was a very strong
Mm,
proselytizing mission
mm,
associated with their work. They wanted to convert, and the Quakers were not interested in that. So they were just a really nice demographic to look at. And when we look at their letters and when we look at their diaries and things like that, they were just genuinely interested in facilitating or extending the boundaries of Black freedom. But then, of course, you had other white North Carolinian teachers who engaged in free people's education for vastly different reasons. Some viewed education as a means of securing an income, so there were financial motivations there. Now, it was actually quite difficult to earn a living through free people's education unless you were fortunate enough to secure sponsorship with an
Mm,
aid or missionary society. And like the Southern Black teachers, most of the Southern white teachers set up self-supporting schools
mm,
that were intended to be financed by rent from the Freedmen's Bureau, but also private tuition fees. And most of the time, the children and the families couldn't pay those tuition
mm,
fees, so the schools didn't last very long. But there was some element of financial motivation, and we can see this in the letters of these teachers. So they're
mm,
writing to the Freedmen's Bureau saying, "Please pay me the rent. I've got children to support. My family rely on this. I'm going to have to quit unless I get this payment."
mm,
So we can see that they were in dire need of an income during
mm,
those post-Civil War post-Civil War years. Um, Another motivation that's emerging for this cohort, the Southern white teachers, is a religious motivation.
mm,
Not like the Quakers. So in particular with the Presbyterians and the
mm,
Episcopalians, we have a lot of white ministers engaging in free people's education, and they have a more pragmatic motivation. On the one hand, they recognize the need for Black Presbyterian and Episcopalian teachers, so they become heavily involved in the creation of higher institutes of education to train Black teachers and preachers. So in the book, there's a little bit of work on Biddle Institute, which is now Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte. That was established by two Southern white Presbyterian ministers, one of which was a former slaveholder, Willis L. Miller. And then I'm also looking currently at St. Augustine's University in Raleigh, which was established by Thomas Atkinson, again, a white Episcopalian minister. So there were pragmatic reasons for them establishing those institutes to furnish Black preachers for the Black communities to avoid Black congregants from going to other denominations that already had ordained Black preachers, which is what Black people were doing in the aftermath of slavery. They were like, I'm not going to be listening to these white preachers anymore. I'm going to leave this place of worship. I'm going to find a Black preacher. But there
mm,
weren't any Black preachers within the Presbyterian or Episcopalian denominations at the time. And again, finally, like you said, a lot of these individuals believed, due to racial stereotypes or the prevailing racial attitudes of the time, that formerly enslaved people needed a religious education. They needed it because to prevent them from becoming or reverting back into different forms of uncivilization. That was a quote I read yesterday. To reform them, to teach them right from wrong. To like
mm.
ameliorate against the supposed degradation of slavery. So all of those factors played in with that particular cohort.
Yeah. No, it's you were talking, I kind of so saw it back to my undergrad years in Louisiana and how it was a culture shock coming from Germany to that region. I'm not sure if you experienced that in North Carolina when you visited for your Fulbright, but it immediately was like, oh, are you Christian? And it was a very different meaning that
Mm.
word had still today for a lot of white Southerners, especially, and the kind of efforts at conversion are just still to this day incredibly active among Southerners, trying to use sort of your need for charity in some form or your desire for community as a mechanism to draw you in.
Yeah.
Um, so that turning that back to your book, what was really interesting was also the kind of atypical anti-Catholicism.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. So I would have experienced something similar when I was in North Carolina, but being raised Catholic, I tended to try
Yes.
and avoid those situations. Um Yeah, so the anti-Catholicism in the United States at the time was obviously very prevalent. In North Carolina, it was, you know what? In North Carolina, I didn't do a whole pile of research into, Catholic
Mm,
schools, Catholic missionaries, Catholic teachers in North Carolina. The main reason for that, of course, was because, it was a very like Christian, Protestant state.
yeah.
And so there wasn't a whole pile of
Mm,
Catholics. So there were people like Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Baptists, Methodists, and all the rest of it. So Catholic
mm,
missionaries were few and far between in North Carolina. And they would have been more prominent in areas like Maryland or maybe little bits of Florida as well.
mm,
Um, the one thing that I did talk about was in the book was in relation to denominational rivalry between the Protestant organizations and the supposed influence of the Catholic missionaries. So, very often, denominational organizations associated with one of those Protestant churches
mm,
would have attempted to rally support from general population um, by positioning the role of Catholic missionaries as a threat. That
mm,
Catholic missionaries were expanding their schools, they were expanding their teachers, they were expanding their numbers. And if we want to prevent this from happening, well, then you guys are going to start having to give us more money, support us a little bit more, come down south to teach because this is your fight as well as ours.
mm,
Now, I'm sure there probably is a whole dissertation, there's a book in that,
mm.
but I didn't really look at that too much. But I will say that I have begun to look at, surprisingly, Irish and British teachers
Oh.
who went to the United States,
Mm,
the South, to teach former slaves. And when I
mm,
look at the cohort of Irish teachers, and I've only begun to research
mm,
this. They also come from Protestant backgrounds, which is
mm,
well, it's not necessarily surprising, but it's interesting
mm.
considering that the vast majority of Irish people in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, even
Yeah.
now,
Yes.
are of a Catholic faith.
Would that been like people that migrated like right after the famine or in the late 50s, 60s to do
What I
this?
yeah, what I'm seeing is that it was people from the at the onset of the Civil War who would have
Okay.
left Ireland during the Civil War. So I would imagine,
Hmm.
and again, this is just me sort of making assumptions, if a lot of them came from Protestant backgrounds, I would imagine that they probably weren't of the peasant class, so they
Right.
probably weren't as directly affected by the
Hmm.
famine as the vast majority of Catholic peasants. Now, that's not to say, obviously, that Protestant people didn't suffer during the famine. Of course, some of them did,
Hmm.
but as a demographic, they would have been a
Hmm.
little better off than,
Right.
Catholic peasants.
Hmm.
So again, and like I said, I haven't done a whole pile of research into this. A lot of these people, one particular woman, her name was Mary Kildare, and she was from
Hmm.
Newry County Down, which is up. It's not in the
Hmm.
south or the Republic as we call it now. She was a missionary
Hmm.
by nature, by profession. So
Oh,
after spending time in the south, she went to a country in Africa. I think it might have been the Congo, but I'd have to double check that. Yeah. So they're kind of like career missionaries.
wow. Well,
Mm.
we have to talk a bit about like sort of the colonialism of that education and the attitudes there in a bit as well.
Hmm.
Um, I need to turn you for a minute because there's oh, there it is. And you had it somewhere on my shelves. This was one of the first books that I had to read about Reconstruction
Yeah.
in grad school. And for those listening, I'm showing Women's Radical Reconstructions of Freedmen's Aid Movement by Carol Faulkner to my guest here. And it sort of you're reading your book brought back some memories of that because one of the things that I distinctly remember about the book was that I was struck by how much these white women going south were willing to take African American children away from their families and move them north into sort of apprenticeships.
Hmm.
And I kind of wondered how much how much did African Americans also sort of illustrate a suspiciousness towards white outsiders coming to them to kind of educate?
Yeah, so great question. So I guess the first thing I would like to say about that is that when we look at the role of northern white teachers who went south to teach former slaves, it's really important to kind of look at the education system that was present in the north at the time.
Mm,
And of course, the common school movement that was established in the 1830s by Horace Mann and co. was created with the very explicit intent of bringing together the various ethnic groups in the United States at the time. So it was created in response to, the immigration of Irish, of German people,
mm,
of Italians, and who were coming into
mhm,
towns and cities and had different customs, norms, languages, practices, religions, ways of being that were considered
mhm,
antithesis to the Protestant work ethic at the time. And so the common school movement was created to sort of bring everyone together and mold them into a specific ideal that
mhm,
was considered acceptable, to middle class Americans at the time, middle class Protestant people at the time. And so these women, a lot of them were teachers.
mhm,
And even if they weren't teachers, they were invariably educated within that sort of
mhm,
context. So they're bringing these kind of preconceived notions with them to the south. And they do believe that the northern way is the best way.
mhm,
The common school system is the best, system. And you have people like Horace James, who was a Massachusetts Freedmen's Bureau officer who worked in North Carolina, and he was saying, we need to implant the Northern Common School movement in the South. Like, that's literally our job. That's what we need to do. And so there was this very profound didactic element to the schools that these women in particular taught. And that's because, of the influence of the Northern Common School movement. And like I said earlier, I think there's a lot we need to
mhm,
kind of tease out with that. Um, the first thing is that when these schools were first established, and formerly enslaved people didn't have the skills or the resources to educate themselves, they happily accepted, the schools that were taught by these men and women. And then over time, as they did gain those skills, they became more adamant in their desires to be educated by members of their own race, which does suggest that they were aware to some degree of this sort of reforming agenda. And a lot of people were suspicious of
mhm,
the efforts of Northern white people and Southern white people. And we see this played out at a variety of different so-called freedmen's conventions, which were held in North Carolina. Around 1865, and they created specific education divisions. And these were men, of
mhm,
course, black men from the north, but mostly from the south, who were, intelligent and
mhm,
articulate. And they said, we're the best people to educate Southern black men and women. Interestingly, actually, a lot of the northern black teachers who came south also, had this sort
mhm,
of reforming agenda because a lot of them had worked as teachers within the common school movement and were educated in the
mhm,
common school movement. And so there was a degree of that even within the northern black teachers. The other thing, as when we're looking at education from a historical viewpoint, another thing that's really important is to consider how influential was any of this anyway,
You had a
realistically.
very good self-own in the book, I have to admit.
I have a sorry.
You have a great self-own of like how much does it actually stick? How much do they remember?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think it was a woman. I think I hope I'm not given the wrong name. I think it was Helena Fox or Helen Fox. She said, and I say this to my students all the time because we look at textbooks. I love
Mm-hmm.
looking at textbooks, and we look at textbooks as like historical tools.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm always reminding them just because we see this textbook, that doesn't tell us what was taught or learned in the
Yeah.
classroom. We don't know if students accepted what they saw, rejected what they saw, or
Mm-hmm.
forgot what they saw, or forgot what they were taught. And we can apply that to our own experiences, you
Mm-hmm.
know, when we're learning at elementary school, high school, college, undergrad, graduate, you know, we accept some things, we reject some things, we forget some things.
Yeah.
So, so that's also important to consider as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Yeah. I love that line of the remember forgetting
Yeah,
and rejecting.
yeah,
That was brilliant.
yeah.
And related to this, it's sort of the education that they're bringing with them, the education system that teachers are bringing, and it's also like a lot of stereotypes they're bringing. And I love that episodes you had in the book, and I'm going to try and recollect it as best as I can, so you correct me if I get parts wrong here. But you have this female white teacher coming south, and she can't find a home in where she can live. So she's initially housed with this African American family and draws this very clear line. It was just incredible how you said she refused to sit at the same table with them because it could give the impression that she is commingling with them, and it's like it almost like it's a paradox. It's like they're trying to change the Southern environment, but at the same time they're still buying into a lot of this racial attitude of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So that woman, her name was Margaret Newbold Thorpe, and herself and her teaching companion were living with a black family. And this was like a very, you know, respectable, like middle class black family. They owned their own home, they were professionals, like, you know, it was just a lovely family to live with. Um, and Margaret and her teaching companion, and because of their role in teaching former slaves, were ostracized by the Southern white community, except for Southern white men who used to call on them, but they, of course, would not go out unless they were chaperoned. But so they experienced the social ostracism
Mm,
particularly difficult to bear. Because they would have been used to having a social life when they were
mm,
in the north. So yeah, there was one instance where she was reflecting on a wedding of a local black couple in the community, and she was invited to the wedding, and they were happy to accept the invitation to the wedding because they didn't have any other options, and they were particularly pleased to find that they were seated at separate tables from the rest of the other guests. And there's a lovely quote in it where she says something along the lines of like she was very pleased to find that the black guests didn't attempt to like interfere with herself or her companion. So they didn't have any sort of notions, I think
mm,
was the word she used, of social equality. So that was a very obvious, you know,
mm.
betrayal of her racial biases. And so it
Yeah.
is this sort of central paradox. And that's why looking at this stuff is actually really difficult, you know,
Hmm.
because on the one hand, you think, okay, wow, these people are doing this really good thing. They're coming down, they're providing education. They're traveling, you know, really long distances. They're leaving the comforts of their
Hmm.
home. They're often doing it, even though their family members don't approve of it. They're coming to a place that is hostile towards them. There's like a lot of other issues like illness, climate, all the rest of it that goes hand in hand with it. So you're thinking, okay, well, fair play to these
Hmm.
people. But then the other side of it is, like you said, they have these deeply entrenched racial
Hmm.
biases that come through implicitly via the flyaway comments they make about the people that they're living with or the people that they're associating with. Like very often they might say something along the lines of how they might remark on how
Hmm.
surprised they were to find that these children were learning as well as
Hmm.
white children in the north. They were genuinely surprised about that. And that kind of brings me on to this other key part of this story. What we tend to find is that the longer they stay in the South, the more those racial biases begin to dissipate slowly
Hmm.
and never completely fully, but over time. And I don't know if there's any deep reflection that ever goes on with
Yeah.
these men and women, but over time we see them mentioning, they're surprised that these
Mm,
children are learning as well as others, or other manners and things like that, or how clean or how respectable they
mm,
are. And they start to sort of like speak about their students in kinder and more
right.
favorable terms. So again, that woman I talked to you about from the North, Harriet M. Buss, when you look at her letters, she worked
Mm,
in North Carolina and Virginia. When she first came down south, she did speak about the children often in disparaging terms, and
mm,
then towards her final few years, her tone, the way she spoke about her students had changed dramatically.
mm,
So even though all of them, I would say, came south with preconceived
mm.
notions of race, of blackness, of the degradation of slavery, in some instances, those ideas and beliefs changed over time.
Yeah, and I mean it's good to kind of bring it back also to like, yeah, why does the African American community eventually want black teachers, right? If like
Yeah,
if they pick up on those things.
exactly.
The
Yeah,
students
exactly.
are smart. So, but since you are also in the history of teaching education in sort of, and you already mentioned you like to look at textbooks, and you have a whole chapter on textbooks and what they talked about. So, readers, if you're listening and you're interested in reading the book, you're forewarned. There is a whole chapter on textbooks.
Yeah.
So what was the most surprising thing? Let's start with that. What's the most surprising thing you found when you looked at these textbooks from like the Reconstruction era?
So I looked at, if I remember correctly now, if I remember correctly, I looked at three different sets of textbooks.
Mhm.
Textbooks that were created for the former slaves after the American Civil War, textbooks created by the Confederacy during the Civil War, and antebellum common school textbooks. Now, the textbooks that were used in most frequently in the schools for former slaves, excuse me, would have been donations of Northern Common School textbooks. And actually, when I think back on it, when I reflect on it, those were the textbooks that were most surprising to me. Because when we look at the geography textbooks in particular, they used to perpetuate very defined notions of race, ethnicity, and nationality
Mm,
in very disparaging terms. And they always, in some shape or form, positioned this sort of racial hierarchy whereby white people were at the top
mm,
and black people were at the bottom. And these textbooks were created in the 1830s, 40s, and
mm,
50s, well before the Civil War,
mm,
well before any of the stuff that we're looking at or talking about now in terms of free people's education. And so it showed me how deeply entrenched concepts of race
mm,
and racism were in American society to
right.
the point that they were being perpetuated by the curricular materials used in the
Mm,
schools. There's
mhm,
one particular graphic that I use now, even still with my students in Mary Immaculate College, and it was called Stages of Society, and there was four different stages of society, and each sort of nationality was grouped according to their supposed stage. So you were either considered
Yes.
civilized, half civilized, barbarous, or savage,
Mm,
depending on your ethnicity and nationality.
mm,
And of course, the Anglo-Saxon, the white person would have been put into the civilized
mm,
category. Um, Black people, enslaved people, African people in the savage or barbarous category,
mm,
and then when I talk about it with my students in Mary Immaculate College, like even though Irish people would have been
mhm.
considered white, they were not in
They're
the
not.
the civilized
Yeah.
category. And I just think it's remarkable how these ideas were um were shared with students from a very early age. Now, again, it does come back to like, well, how much of this did the young people accept? But a lot of people did say, even like more recent scholars, that when they were learning about this material in school in the 1950s, the
Hmm.
1960s, like 100 years later,
Right.
they were asked to memorize the different categories,
Hmm.
and those kind of lessons on race, they internalized those lessons on race a little more than say lessons on, I don't know, like the climate or whatever it might
Hmm.
have been at the time. So yeah, I think that was the most interesting thing that I came across with those textbooks.
Yeah, sort of the self-perpetuation of your assumptions that you unfortunately do have oftentimes too, that they read and they seek what confirms. And
Yeah, yeah.
um,
And
and
so when you look at things like, yes, the abolitionist movement had kind of taken hold in the
mm,
North around the 1830s and, on all the rest of it, and the North had abolished slavery like decades before. The North was still an incredibly racist place. The
right,
North still benefited
right,
from slavery. The North benefited from racism,
mhm.
and these ideas were taught to young children from a very early age.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why Ohio says we're not allowing any black person to move to us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It
yeah,
is a
exactly. Yeah.
it is a hostile environment in many
Hmm.
regards.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, um, but you also have like these the so we talked about you talked about the textbooks that existed, and now you're also having textbooks that are primarily made for this new group of people that are getting educated.
Hmm.
And it seemed like there were some interesting changes primarily directed towards this specific audience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So again in 1865, a publishing company called the American Tract Society began creating a series of textbooks
Mm,
specifically for the former slaves. So they were free people's texts or free people's
mm,
textbooks. And they were literally called like the Freedman's Primer, the Freedman's First Reader, the Freedman's Spelling Book, and things like that. Um, the readers, the primers, the spelling books, things like that were fairly similar to those that were published in the North. And again, from our contemporary perspective, we might think that a lot of the stories or lessons were a little
mm,
outlandish, but they were didactic, and that was the way the common school movement was, and that was the way the schools for the free people that were created by the Northerners, at least, were intended to be, and so the textbooks sort of reflected that as well. But within those series of textbooks, you also had a number of advice manuals that were
mm,
written specifically for the former slaves. So Clinton B. Fisk was an author in particular, and those textbooks were called Advice to Free People, Friendly
mm,
Counsels to Free People, and things like that. These are really interesting because these attempted to teach the free people about their duties and responsibilities as free men and women. Um, and some of the stuff that they said was just bizarre. So, for example, Clinton Fisk in his textbook said something along the lines, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, it's okay to go back to your former masters, you need to get work, they need workers, there's no harm, there's no shame in going back to your former masters. Like he literally said that.
easy for
Um,
somebody in New England to say.
Exactly, yeah, and an abolitionist. He was an
Yeah.
abolitionist as well, which is quite interesting. They chastised black women for quote
Mm,
unquote being immoral during times of slavery, for having children from multiple partners. He said in his book, and this is a quote, if in your slave life you have been careless of your morals, end quote. Enslaved women were not careless of their morals, they were subject to sexual exploitation.
yeah.
Telling them, you need to find a partner, you need to settle down. And they also try to enforce like these sort of like gendered ideologies.
Mm,
Men go
mm,
out and work, provide for your family. Women, learn how to cook, make bread, keep a clean house, and all that sort of stuff. So that stuff was, um, yeah, that stuff was unusual. That stuff was interesting.
Hmm.
The only kind of solace I take from that is that I don't think they were used in a great many schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one benefit in that.
But it still
Yeah.
gives us a very clear indication of
Hmm.
the way these people thought and
Yeah.
their views of Black freedom.
Hmm. Yeah, also sort of this it it reminds me, or the way some of these things that you wrote about, it reminds me of this late 19th century caricature of sort of the imperial turn of, I think it's Uncle Sam standing at the front of the classroom, and you have like the Philippines and Cuba and Guam and Puerto Rico as sort of unruly kids in the on the benches, and I think the African Americans. No, I think the black one is actually the one that cleans the window, and the Native Americans sort of looking in, and it's this very it's a treating of what they considered lesser racial people as children,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah. And that was prevalent, like I said, in the United States curricular materials from the early 19th
yeah,
century.
yeah. It's somewhat devastating that and then continuing, right? That
Exactly.
they're being taught that in the 1870s, 80s.
Hmm.
And of course, then you eventually get the Jim Crow law
Hmm. Hmm.
textbooks that are not much better than that. And
Hmm. Hmm.
it just
Exactly.
perpetuates that racial um, hierarchy
Hmm.
in so many ways,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Um, let's see. So you do kind of give a nod also to the importance of teacher education.
Hmm.
And it is sort of an interesting juxtaposition in many ways because in many ways teacher education is more sort of in the Du Bois mind frame of like we're needing liberal arts based
Yeah.
schools,
Hmm.
but a lot of what these teachers are supposed to do is in the Booker T. Washington notion of technical education,
Yeah.
crafts that you should
Yeah.
be learning. So it
Yeah.
seems like there's almost a bit of a conflict between what is needed versus what's the outcome desired.
Yeah. Now, so the time period that I specifically looked at went up to 1875,
Right.
1876. And admittedly, during that period, you know, education or the education that was provided for formerly enslaved people, though not without flaws, was a lot more positive than what was to come. And so the institutes for higher education that were created for Black people throughout North Carolina in particular, all of those HBCUs that we still have today, they did, they were set up to create, mostly teachers and preachers for the Black community. And there wasn't so much of an emphasis on the provision of industrial training. That all changed, of course, then with Samuel Armstrong and Booker T. Washington. Um, After the 1870s into the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, when industrial education became the default model for um, Black people's educational experiences in the South. And so you had a very brief period
Mhm.
of, positive experiences where, Southern Black people could look to the future with hope, and think, okay, something good can come of this. And then, systematic changes began to occur, and it became an uphill battle after that to try and improve educational outcomes and educational access for
Mhm.
Southern Black individuals.
Well, it was also interesting considering where you end. It's sort of it's starting that segregation too,
Yes.
and like this
Yeah.
just like the what was it? You could use tax monies for racially segregated schools too, or like
Yeah.
that's the racial community only supports their own racial
Yeah,
schools. And like
yeah.
it just got, I mean, it's the start of what you're eventually challenging in the 50s, right?
Exactly, yeah. So what you see, so everything was kind of like tipping along okay until, military troops were withdrawn from the
Mm,
South and Southern Democrats regained control of the legislature. And then they started to use legislative measures to undermine Black
mhm,
education. Up until that point, they didn't have that control. They attempted to undermine it in a variety of different ways, extra legal ways, through white paramilitary
yeah.
violence, of course, with organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League and so forth. But once the Democrats got into power, they were able to use legislative measures to undermine Black education. And that's when we really see the systematic dismantling
Mhm.
of all of the educational gains that were made during that Reconstruction period.
Yeah, like it's that was a quicker answer than I expected.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Well,
like it's
I didn't go into too much detail in the
right.
book,
No,
because that is the start of another story.
right.
With the introduction of like segregated schools,
Hmm.
Jim Crow laws, the
Right.
desegregation of schools, and of course, there have been lots of really, really good studies on that in North Carolina, especially,
Hmm.
how the segregated model eventually kind of worked out well
Hmm.
for a lot of Black communities because they had Black teachers, like you said,
Hmm.
who
Yeah.
were more committed to their growth and development. And they had pride within, they were
Hmm.
taught to have pride within the Black community, and there was a sort of like communal nature to the schools, and which were
Hmm.
really, really important, which a lot of these schools ultimately lost out on when desegregation was rolled out in the 1950s. So like yeah, and again, that's a whole other history and a whole other story.
Yeah, and actually I had that on here on my little notepad, and um one thing that really struck me, and I usually don't read an author's their own text, but I thought this was one line that just was so beautiful, where you wrote towards the end of the book in the conclusion, quoting here, the loss of black teachers, as numerous historians have shown, dealt a particular hard blow to black communities, leading to the com concomitant loss of school tradition, trophies, mascots, and support systems. And it it's not just North Carolina. I had a student when I was doing a research seminar in Macon, Georgia one time as a professor, and he wanted to talk about desegregation of the school system. And it was very much sort of the, hate to say it this way, but it was very much the Jackie Robinson story of like integration, amazing, awesome, it's all positive. And I was like pushing him a little bit and be like, but what about the black schools? What about the black community? And he started digging, and he
Mhm,
actually found like a quote from a teacher, paraphrasing, that was like, no, it was bad because we lost our jobs and we lost sort of the traditions of our schools.
mhm, mhm,
Sort of exactly what you're saying. So
mhm,
it it's sort of nice to see there what you're doing, that we're celebrating integration, but we're oftentimes forgetting what goes along with that integration for these communities.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, of course, a lot of these schools were significantly underfunded.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was like huge disparities within the funding system. And again, that stemmed from like systemic racism and structural racism within the different policy frameworks that existed at the time. But again, and again, I'm not an expert on this particular area, but what we do see again is that Black agency coming to the
Hmm.
forefront and that emphasis that was placed upon the communal efforts of the community rather than that sort of individualism which would have dominated, the way white Southerners or even white Northerners looked at access to education at the time.
Hmm.
And so I think those two strengths, Black agency and the communal nature of their interactions with different structures in society, really served to benefit them during times of great
Mm.
challenge.
No, and I think that, excuse me, in many ways is why your book was so interesting because it spoke so much to the origins of a lot of modern issues in
Exactly.
Southern education,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
in the country's education in general in the United States that
Hmm.
um, are still there. Like, I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
that's what we're still struggling with, and
Hmm.
like I could see so many of the issues of like divorcing out of a school district to create your own independent school district to kind of
Hmm.
avoid being with African American students, or public school, private school emergence and charter
Hmm.
schools and all that. Like, it kind of swung, or you could hear the echoes of that
Hmm.
in many parts of your book.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so as somebody who teaches for future teachers,
Hmm.
what do you think is sort of the greatest lesson we should learn from what happened here? Like,
Mm. Um,
or lessons. It doesn't have to be one.
yeah. So I love looking at contemporary issues through through a historical lens, because I believe, when we are experiencing contemporary issues, it can be very difficult to like divorce from it our own preconceived ideas
Mm,
that we may have. But very often, when we're looking at a contemporary issue through a historical lens, we can kind of come at it from a fresh perspective in a
mhm,
way, and we can kind of look at it more objectively. And the hope, of course, is that you're able to apply that new understanding to what's going on in
mm,
the world today. So, with my students at Mary Immaculate College, I really just want them to understand the ways in which education can be manipulated to achieve
mm,
particular aims that are not always done to support the
mm,
children within the school system, and that there is invariably an agenda at play. And just to be able to kind of like look at that objectively. If I was to
mm,
ask my students to look at the education system today and tell me, what's the agenda, or like
mhm,
who's it benefiting, who's it serving, who's it marginalizing, I think they'd struggle to answer
mhm,
that, because you're in the thick of it, you've been
right.
educated in it, you're being educated to educate in it. It's hard to remove yourself from that situation. But when you look at stories like the one I've told, as well as countless
Mm,
others, you're able to see very clearly, okay, this is why these schools were established.
mhm,
This is how it served certain interests. This is how it served to marginalize specific groups. It's very, very clear. And when you get that level of understanding, my intention is that you're then able to apply it to the education system today. Or, it can be related to any aspect of history, not just education, but that you're able to apply your understanding of what you learnt about in the past to
mm,
what's going on in society today. And I think my students do benefit from that. So I look at, I obviously teach in Ireland, and I prepare students for the Irish education system. So a lot of what I teach is based upon the Irish educational history, but I
mhm,
have managed to weave in elements of this history as well, and they absolutely love it and they find it really interesting. So I compare, for example, um, there was a time in Ireland when education was banned for Catholics, and
mhm,
Catholics had to set up secret schools.
mhm,
So there was a series of laws that were introduced known as the penal laws, which
mhm,
outlawed Catholic education. And Catholics again showed agency, and they
right.
established secret schools called hedge
Mhm,
schools. And so I kind of compare that to the slave codes that were
Mm.
introduced around the 1830s and how enslaved people used their initiative to establish
Mhm.
secret schools. And yeah, I think based upon the feedback that I've received and based upon even their assessment submissions, their results are going to be released today. They
Oh,
are able to look at the past and see all of those issues that I said previously and kind of like use that to reflect on what's happening in education today.
yeah, and I mean, in a globalizing world,
Exactly.
the issues that a teacher in Japan faces are the same that we face here in Europe as in North America on many levels.
Exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah.
The kids are not that dissimilar
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I had you on now for about an hour and 20 minutes, so that
Mhm.
is usually where I like to draw the line. And your last answer was just perfect in sort of drawing this conversation about education and history to a close. So if you're interested in Anna Marie's book, it is A Contested Terrain, Freed People's Education in North Carolina During the Civil War and Reconstruction. Available with Fordham University Press since March of this year, 2025. And then thank you so much for taking a little time this morning to chat with me.
And thank you so much, Niels, again for having me on. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.